This past year I was in Syria after the fall of Assad. Amazing to people pressing for justice there. But I was also in Israel and the West Bank and met inspiring Israeli human rights lawyers and activists who were saying we need to have the accountability for these crimes, because how are we going to be living in some kind of safety and security in the years to come? You know, the 10-year-old now who's lost both his or her parents in Gaza, what are they going to be doing in a decade?
Steve Crawshaw is our guest this afternoon. Fantastic to have you in the studio with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You are the author of Prosecuting the Powerful, War Crimes and the Battle for Justice, a timely book which is out in paperback tomorrow. Justice is very much in the air at the moment, or sometimes you feel lack of it, quite honestly. Steve is the former chief foreign correspondent at The Independent and was UK director of Human Rights Watch. You've also worked for Freedom from Torture as well.
And Amnesty International, correct. Yes.
And Amnesty, okay.
Yeah.
So a man with impeccable credentials. I should say that on the cover of the book are three men, Putin, Netanyahu and al-Assad. Now, two are still in power. One's in exile in a luxury tower block, presumably in Moscow. Will they ever face justice, do you think?
This is, as you say, it's the kind of the question at the heart of everything, really. And so I guess the short answer to all of that is none of us can know for certain. I mean, there are no immediate ways of getting our hands on any of those three. But I think it's worth dipping back into history briefly of like so many of the big conflicts that we've seen. It seemed nothing would ever happen. And for me, a kind of central moment in my own biography, my own life, but also in a sense for the storytelling of the book, was when I was a journalist, as you mentioned, at The Independent. I was covering the Balkans and I met Slobodan Milosevic, the then Serb leader. The way that we met was pretty random itself, but we met in this fancy London hotel and I kind of bluffed my way in different ways. Sat down with him. This was 1992, the very beginning of the Bosnian War, and I was just back from a trip to Sarajevo. And people had just started to mention the possibility of a war crimes tribunal. So at the end of a longer interview on other themes, I said, by the way, what about this? Oh, yes, a marvellous idea. And I said, yeah, but what about you, Mr. President, might you? And me? No, I am for peace. And that meeting was very memorable to me for lots of different reasons. But I remember thinking afterwards, not only did he feel confident he would never face justice, but I also thought it could never happen. And yet, if you like, quote unquote, only 9 years later, he landed up there. Just last year, within the past year, we had the former president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte. He was trotting around Hong Kong saying, come and get me if you like, to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, who had put out an arrest warrant for him. Yeah, come and get me. He flies back into Manila and sure enough, handcuffs are put in and he is flown to The Hague and he's about to go on trial there in The Hague. So we never know. To go to the three that you mentioned, Assad is now in Moscow, as you say, living in luxury, but he's disposable goods now. He has no value to Russia, really, so there's lots of reasons why. And Putin and Netanyahu, very, very interesting. Both of them have had to change their travel plans in the last couple of years. They couldn't go to South Africa, couldn't do this, couldn't do that.
That's all they've had to do.
That's absolutely right. That's so far, but the same could have been said of Milosevic in 1995 or 1996.
So don't give up hope.
Don't give up hope, really. And what it means is the pressures and where does the society itself go? So Israel at the moment, there's not great love for Netanyahu, to put it mildly. And before 7th of October, of course, there was even less. And I think it's a question of, does Israeli society come to that sense of, actually, this guy really should be put on trial, not just for the sake of the Palestinians who've died, but for Israeli society, for the stability, the security of the future. The same kind of journey that other countries have been on, thinking actually accountability does really matter.
We should also say that actually, haven't Hamas also been indicted?
They have, exactly. And that's really important. It's not like either or. Of course, Hamas leaders were indicted for the horrendous crimes, not only, but especially the horrendous crimes of 7th of October. And those terrible crimes clearly, well, they're so obviously very, very serious crimes. What is odd sometimes is when you get the narrative, well, they've done all these awful things, so therefore somehow the other side, in a way, that trumps. And it doesn't. That's, of course, not the way justice works. A crime is a crime,
sure,
whoever has committed it.
Goodness me, though. I mean, this book was such an education because there are so many grey areas. And perhaps we could talk about how the USA conducted itself after 9/11, because that was obviously a seismic and terrible event. But how did the USA react?
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? So as older listeners will remember, we kind of lived through that period, although it slightly slid into history and been forgotten. So, as you say, horrendous, the attacks of 9/11, so dreadful and so brutal. And the then US administration, their takeaway from that was, well, they've done terrible things, so we need to go on what was called the dark side. And how dark it was of torture was just completely normalized. Things that the Americans themselves had prosecuted at the Tokyo Tribunal, for example, after 1945, waterboarding. That was a crime then, and of course remained a crime. But no, that's okay. And again, first, morally and legally, it was completely wrong. But what they were so slow to understand, but I hope has now been accepted in the meantime, looking back, was it, of course, made life more dangerous. It made the world a less secure place. The photographs that came out of Abu Ghraib, the prison in Iraq, where terrible torture had been committed constantly, and people took the photos of it, and those got leaked eventually. Those, not only were those shocking to those who cared about such crimes, but it also fueled violence in the years to come.
Terrorists were born as a result.
Terrorists were born, exactly. Yeah. Terrorists were born. And so that I did quite a lot of travelling when I was writing the book. I went to Ukraine several times. This past year I was in Syria after the fall of Assad. Amazing to people pressing for justice there. But I was also in Israel and the West Bank and met inspiring Israeli human rights lawyers and activists who were saying we need to have the accountability for these crimes, because how are we going to be living in some kind of safety and security in the years to come? The 10-year-old now who's lost both his or her parents in Gaza, what are they going to be doing in a decade? You need to think that you need some kind of closure. To quote the chief US prosecutor at Nuremberg, Robert Jackson, he talked about the importance of Nuremberg because it could stay the hand of vengeance. Well, and that phrase, I think, is so resonant today.
A lot of people say Nuremberg was, what's the expression, victor's justice.
Yes.
And again, something I learned from the book, of course, Britain and other allies, we did not behave impeccably in World War II. We did win. We were on the winning side.
Yes.
And therefore our carpet bombing of German civilians was not part of what went on at Nuremberg.
Yeah.
The Germans weren't in the dock either for their bombing campaigns. Is that right?
That's right. So it was precisely because of what you've just described.
Yeah.
So initially, when the planning was first happening of, the war hadn't been won yet by any means, but earlier in the war, it was like, okay, this terrible bombing raids, not just on Britain, of Coventry, London and elsewhere, but in Minsk, in Belgrade, a whole bunch of Warsaw, lots of Nazi bombing, which took no account of civilians, and therefore was already on the list. But by the time it got to 1945, more than 500,000 people had died in the Anglo-American raids, most famously in Dresden, about 30,000, but Hamburg was pretty much as big, and lots of other raids across the country. And it was like, well, we can't really accuse them of those things because obviously the finger will then be pointed at us. So that was dropped out. And you're quite right. The phrase victor's justice has been used often of Nuremberg, and in some obvious ways, like the one that you've just mentioned there, it was. But it was also a foundation stone. The defence worked really hard, and there was some acquittals at Nuremberg. People often forget this, were acquittals.
So what sort of people were acquitted?
The people who'd been, if you like, the pen pushers a bit. Now, pen pushing can actually, in its most extreme version, absolutely be like Adolf Eichmann, who was later went on trial in Jerusalem much later. But he'd never pulled the trigger or done something physical, but he was responsible for organising. But more generally, people who were, they were around, but they weren't maybe directly involved. Those people ended up being acquitted. And civil servant types.
Right. The Russians were never... I mean, what went on in Berlin, for example, when the Red Army got there, is something that people still find, I gather, incredibly difficult to discuss.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, now it is discussed in Germany. In Russia, it's a complete taboo. The rape that happened during that time, I mean, so many. It was just horrific, and that was a complete taboo for many years. It was to some extent in German society, although much later a book that had been written at the time was published. And more generally, it wasn't known. And then there was a great book written by Anthony Beevor about 20 years ago now, the historian, who, writing about the downfall of Berlin, laid a lot of this out, including drawing on Russian archives which would now be closed, but at that time were open up. So there was a lot of that stuff that was going on, but nonetheless, I say Nuremberg was a foundation stone, even if there were things that you left out.
Right. So let's fast forward to 2002 and the establishment of the International Criminal Court. Who actually worked to make it happen? I
love these stories, and in a sense, although there's so much darkness that we're facing today in many, many different ways, and you constantly hear people say, oh, the whole thing is gone, it's all lost, nothing can be achieved. Now, it is true that we're facing a lot of darkness, but the idea of an international criminal court seemed utterly unachievable. It was first floated way back in the 19th century when the Geneva Convention started coming up, and the first Geneva Convention was in place, but one of the guys responsible for that said, yeah, but they don't kind of obey it. We need to have enforceability. Well, the governments which had, just like today, the governments which had signed the convention didn't actually want it to be enforceable. So that went nowhere. At different points, the idea was there. At the time of Nuremberg and immediately after, and especially with the creation of the Genocide Convention, 1948, which was due to an absolute obsessive character, Raphael Lemkin, who Philip Sands has written about Berlin in East-West Street. At that time, it was like, well, if we have a genocide convention, it needs to be enforced somewhere, so we must have an international court. But of course, all the powerful governments were not interested in a place. So what I describe in the book is some of these visionary types who often describe themselves as Don Quixote figures. One was A.N.R. Robinson, Ray Robinson, who was a law student from Trinidad and Tobago. He was studying at Oxford, and his a fellow student, American Robert Wurtzel, was writing a PhD on writing his thesis on the Nuremberg trials, and both of them chatted together and said, like, why would you just have one trial? You need to have the possibility of doing it for the future. Now, that could just seem like, student conversations in the pub, but they both remained obsessed with that in different ways. Ray Robinson, A.N.R. Robinson, became Prime Minister and then President of Trinidad and Tobago. And that's where you have the sweetness of history coming together, because as he became Prime Minister of his country, it was just the time when everything else was changing. The Berlin Wall was coming down. So in autumn 1989, during the very weeks that the Berlin Wall came down and everything else was up for grabs, if you like, he put onto the agenda of the United Nations saying, we need to have an international criminal court. So he asked for that in 89, a few years passed, and then in Rome in 1998, despite the hatred of the US for the idea, but it happened, it was agreed in Rome in 98 and then became real, as you say, in 2002.
And is it now under threat because of the current American administration?
It really is. So George W. Bush didn't like it, and he came up with something called the Hague, well, it was colloquially called the Hague Invasion Clause. In other words, the idea, if you ever dare to seize an American for whatever reason, we will invade the Hague. It was kind of just rhetoric in those days. It was an absurd, it was dark rhetoric, but it was never going to happen. But Trump has taken it way forward. He's put on a series of sanctions on both prosecutors, on judges, and he's trying basically to suffocate the court itself. Incredibly dangerous, because this is the institution that's been created and as described, Don Quixote figures over so many years went for it. It would be impossible to recreate if it's crushed. And for me, it's a sadness. Obviously, it's dark that an elected US president can want to destroy an institution which is fundamentally about the rule of law. But not only that, we've seen almost complete silence from the European governments, all of whom, including Britain, all the European Union governments, were all part of creating that court. And now they kind of sit and go, and haven't managed to find their voice.
Yeah, well, we're all operating double standards, aren't we? I mean,
Sadly.
Ursula von der Leyen, I think she's been very vocal condemning Putin and the invasion of Ukraine, but less keen on saying too much about Netanyahu.
Yes, exactly. And although it was sometimes almost exactly the same crimes. She described, attacks on infrastructure, the starvation, those kind of crimes, of course, were exactly what we saw later in Gaza.
So do you honestly think that the court will carry on?
I do think it can, but I do think it needs all of us to stand up for all of the countries. And of course, voters affect what politicians are thinking in some ways as well. And I think that it absolutely can survive, and it's interesting, heard there's a key former senior British military prosecutor who was also very senior in the court, resigned because of some of the pressures, but he said absolutely we can. And I think when I talked earlier about how impossible things have happened, that's not just the creation of the court, but even as I began writing the book and talking to very, very wise heads then, he said, yeah, but so the Ukraine war had just begun and terrible crimes were being committed. Yes, but the president of a permanent member of the Security Council, they're never going to indict a man like that.
Isn't that?
But they then did.
They did, but
and they requested an arrest warrant, and then confirmed by the judges. It's 6 months later issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister, as well as the Hamas leaders, which we've described as well, which is, if you like, less complicated. But the fact that they said, we just do what we do. That's the point. Justice is supposed to be blind. Look at the statue on top of the courthouses. The idea is that you don't look at who's committed in making your choices. You look at what has happened, and then you go where the evidence leads you. So the court is trying to do that, and I think it's important. I hope that European leaders will stand up for that, understanding not just that it's legally important, but as described, that for the practicality of living in a safe world, you need institutions like that to exist.
Okay, and you also need people who are able and willing, brave enough to bear witness.
Yes.
To speak.
Yes.
Is that always possible?
That is so important. I'm glad you highlighted that one, because that was something which in a way was a bit of a learning curve, I think, for the International Criminal Court as well. International justice, as we've just been discussing, is pretty new. In the 1990s was the Hague Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, then on Rwanda, and then came the International Criminal Court, which kind of emerged from those. But in a way, it was still a lawyer's thing, and they weren't really thinking of the survivors. But in the meantime, the survivors' voices have been incredibly important. And it was interesting, when I spoke to the chief prosecutor of the court, and I said, who is your legal hero? And I expected him to say, one of those names perhaps who helped to create Nuremberg or the courts and this, that, the other. And it turned out he did have some of those. But he said, my heroes are the people who come and stand and give testimony, knowing the difficulty of doing that is obvious to all of us. The sexual violence, the rape, the killing, all of these things, you have to relive that and be questioned about it. But showing that courage and having the belief that by my giving testimony, perhaps I can help first bring this person to justice who's now in the dock, but also help for the future to stop those things happen. So I think that's unbelievably important, and those survivor voices and their role has become more and more important in the past 20 years.
I think so many people this week just feel something approaching despair about how justice only ever seems to be meted out to the small person.
Yes.
And the big guys just get away. They just get away with whatever they like.
It is odd to reflect on that. Prosecuting the Powerful, the title of this book, and I've been reflecting on that as you were saying earlier. It's so horrendous the way they have been protected, but I have to say I do see parallels. Before it seemed impossible a prime minister or a president or a former prime minister or former president could be prosecuted, and now that has definitely changed. Equally, the Epsteins and the Weinsteins and all of their friends, they were absolutely confident, but it is of course shocking to all of us reading those email exchanges, because they just drip. They drip with the entitledness, which I guess makes all of us feel sick to the stomach. And I think there are significant parallels. Weinstein, of course, now is in jail, the Hollywood mogul, and Epstein died behind bars. But more generally, that's still a huge challenge. And I think it's interesting that those two things, those domestic crimes and those international crimes, of course, are different in some ways. But I think there's a real parallel of, if we try hard enough, we can do it. And again, there were, of course, individuals who bore testimony that helped with those cases, which, with such courage that they came forward, initially ignored and eventually not ignored.
Yeah, absolutely huge respect to them. So interesting to talk to you. Of the three on the cover, Putin, Netanyahu and Assad, who do you think is the most likely to end up behind bars in our lifetime?
That's a great question. I suppose I'd go for Assad because he has so little political value.
So the Russians could just...
And the Russians could say, you know what, we'd like this to happen economically. Please lift that, and you can have Assad. But Netanyahu, very, very interesting to see where Israel... It's not a matter maybe of delivering to The Hague, but will Israel also say, you know what, we need to draw a line under this. I'm less confident. I myself, I studied Russian, I lived in Russia, and I'm much less confident that Russia can get to, but that same place, I hope it can. But I do hope that we'll see some of those brought to justice eventually.
Really interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much
for coming in today. Steve Crawshaw, Prosecuting the Powerful, War Crimes and the Battle for Justice. It's a fascinating paperback and it's out tomorrow.